right. Well, welcome campers. This is going to be fun. I'm excited to hear about what Ted has in store for us today. Talking about setting data source credentials with Power BI REST and how. And in fact, I was looking over the notes and it's like this alphabet soup of things that some of which I know, some of which I pretend to know, and some of which I just have never heard of before. So I'm excited to hear what Ted has to offer on this. We're going to be looking at things that, every organization, as you got larger and larger, and you need to manage more and more, and different people are running it as code or running, PowerShell scripts, all those things, they all have in common. They've got to have some kind of credential to get access to the data because it's always all being protected. And being able to manage that is a real challenge. Especially as you grow into, larger scale organizations, it's an opportunity and a challenge. And Ted, I'm excited about hearing what you have to say because, dude, you and I go way back, and there's so much about you've forgotten more about this than I've ever known. So I'm excited to hear about what you have to say on this incredible topic.
Well, thank you. So today we're going to be looking at writing code. I'm going to be writing C#, but anything I did could also be done in PowerShell or other languages. I'm going to be using the Power BI REST API, and we're going to be setting credentials. And there's lots of different scenarios where this gets to be very beneficial. So what we're going to couple notes is that if you've never gone to Power BI DevCamp's portal, it's at powerbidevcamp.net. So for instance, if you go to the portal, and let me kind of jump over here, and you go to this one particular page for this session, you can download the PowerPoint slides, you can download the code sample that we're going to be looking at, as we go. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out is that there's also a code sample, that is in GitHub. So if I go back to my browser for a second, and so if I go to github.com Power BI DevCamp, we have a bunch of repositories, and the one for this session is going to be a GitHub repo that has a C# application. It's just a simple C# console application that is going to authenticate and get access tokens and kind of show us, the code that is required. And note that if you want to get some of this up and working, there is an app settings.cs file right here. So as I go through and I kind of tell you how to create Azure AD applications to support this, generally you're going to be kind of taking values and pasting them inside here. If you wanted to further protect things like, passwords, in something like Azure Key Vault, I've left that as an exercise, to the reader to kind of put something behind app.settings. Okay, but this is, go ahead.
Yeah, I've dropped those links in the announcement, the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, and if anybody pops in there, I'll be sure to pass on those questions for you.
That's very nice of you, sir. Okay, now we're going to do a bunch of demos, and let me just kind of paint the big picture. So what we might have is a web data source, behind a Power BI data set that uses anonymous credentials. But when you upload the PBX file, it doesn't automatically work for refresh till you patch the credentials, even if they're anonymous. We're going to look at data set that has a SQL data source and how to, set or patch. Patch is kind of a dev geek word. Set or patch. It turns out, Scott, that the HTTP verb that we use when we set credentials is patch. So that's why people, sometimes refer to it as patching credentials. Yeah. We're also going to patch credentials, not just for a data set, but what if you had a paginated report that connected directly to SQL? There's no Power BI data set involved, but you're still able to set the credentials. How about if you have a data flow and your data flow, is connected to a SQL data source? Once again, all this is available, to accomplish programmatically, so you can automate things instead of doing them by hand. We have a Azure Data Lake storage file, and we're going to kind of work with key credentials. Also, there are two cases where we're going to work with OAuth credentials, at the very end. Now, as we keep going through here, these are the sections that we're going to look at And what we need to do is kind of start with a quick refresher or primer on when you want to call the Power BI REST API, how does authorization work and how does authentication work? We have more geek terms for you, Scott. Auth-N and Auth-C, just basically refers to, authentication and authorization. So let's kind of start with the basics. I want to write some code that's going to call the Power BI REST API and complete some operation. And when I call the Power BI REST API, I can configure things to, make that call, as a user, or I can make that call as a service principal. Now, you could also technically make the call as a service principal profile, but service principal and service principal profile have the exact same thing. So I think I'm not going to complicate it by adding service principal profile, but as we go through, you can assume that if I say this works for a service principal, it will also work for a service principal profile when calling the Power BI REST API. Now, we can call the Power BI REST API as a user. So in my demo, I'm going to call it just under my own identity. And to do that, we're going to have to pre-create an Azure AD application and create it specifically to support user authentication. When I acquire access tokens, I'm going to have to make sure that I get delegated permissions, baked into those access tokens. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail over the next couple slides. But alternatively, I can also call the REST API as a service principal. Once again, to do this, I have to create an Azure AD application, but I'll set it up differently than I would, when I create an application to set up user authentication. And one thing that you're going to see, I'll keep repeating this over the next couple of slides, is that user calls require delegated permissions, but service principals don't get delegated permissions. So the access tokens, don't contain those. If you're fuzzy about that, Scott, right now, I haven't explained it well. Give me a couple more slides to get into that. Okay, now let's say that I want to, call the REST API, as a user. So I go and I create a Azure AD application. And for those of you, haven't done that before, I could go to the Azure portal. And, once we get to the Azure portal, I can say I want to go to Active Directory. And now there is app registrations. So within the tenant that has the Power BI workspaces that you're dealing with, what we can do is we can come up here and we can click on new registration. Okay, so now back to the slides. So let's say I want to create one for user authentication. It's easier than people think. All you got to do is say, public native client. At least this is what you'd use for the C# application. That's just going to run on my desktop. If you're creating other web applications, you might do something different, but then you're going to use a redirect URI without HTTPS, HTTP localhost. And this is something that Microsoft Identity uses, so you can run code from a machine, and there's going to be a recent enhancements in the way that we authenticate that makes it secure. But what's important here, and what I see a lot of confusion on, is that you don't need to register any permissions, in the application. Instead, they're going to be kind of handled by the C# application. So really, you create a new application, set it to public client, add in localhost, click register, and you're done. And so, then what you're going to do is you're going to get that application ID, and you're going to add that, into the app settings.config file, and that's it. You can go ahead and run it. Now, the way things work, is that there is this token manager class. And if I go back here, to this application that we're going to be looking at today, what you'll see is I have a class called token manager. I'm not going to dig into the guts of these methods because they'll hurt you. And I've got other better stuff to hurt you, as we go through this session here. But notice it's kind of pulling things out of application settings. And the other thing to note is if I go to, manage packages, you can see that we're using the very latest version of the Microsoft.identity.client, which is called MSAL for .NET. And if I just kind of take a quick peek, at one of these right here, you can see we're using classes, from that library, to set up our authentication flows. Okay, now I'm going to leave it as an exercise for you. who are watching this, if you want to drill down into this code. Now, what you'll see is that when we have user authentication, we also need to, have these lists of permissions. So for my demo, I'm going to use this, it's basically a string array of a bunch of strings, but each one of these strings, has the resource in question, which is https:// analysis windows.net Power BI API / so that's kind of the first part, the resource URI. And then the last part, is the delegated permissions that you need. And the idea is that your application passes, when it wants to acquire a token, it passes a list of these delegated permissions. And the very first time, the user, is responding to this interactive login, Azure AD is going to prompt the user saying, this application wants to do this, running as you with your identity. So you have to accept that, for things to go on. And then after the first authentication request, Azure AD remembers that the user has approved the request. Now, let's switch over and talk about, calling the Power BI REST API as a service principal. So why would I do this? Well, service principal authentication is just OS calling across the network and getting back an access token. When we authenticate users, because of, new security enhancements we're seeing with things like, dual factor authentication, you're not going to be able to run a batch program that gets an access token for a user because it requires interaction. So if you want to run a batch process and guarantee there is no user interaction issues, running as a service principal, that's what it's made for. It also removes dependencies on, Bob, he's the owner, of all these dataset credentials and he's left the company. That creates a whole host of issues. So working with a service principal kind of takes, the impact away as users come and go from the organization. Now, there's also going to be downsides to using service principals when it comes to setting credentials. So here are the three I want to call out. When you set credentials with a service principal, the data set is locked out in the UI. And we're going to see that in a second. So you have to do everything with code. If you can't do it with code, you can't do it. When you do something as a user, you could log on to the Power BI service, as the same user. And then after you run some code, you can massage what you've done through the UI. There's two other little gotchas. When you set up a refresh schedule, it's impossible to set an email address of who gets the callbacks. And then also with importing data flows, that's not supported for service principal. Okay, so just some little gotchas. Now, when we're dealing with access control for a service principal, it's very different from users. So users have delegated permissions, but service principals do not. There's nothing about service principals accessing the Power BI REST API where Power BI ever looks at an Azure AD permission to decide whether the caller, should succeed. Instead, what we have to do is we have to configure access, for service principals at the Power BI tenant level. So to do this, you either have to be or have a friend, that is the Power BI administrator in that tenant. Now, once we've enabled service principal, to call the Power BI REST API, that's step number one, but it has no access to any workspaces. So then what you have to do is you have to take the principal, and just like a user, you can go to a workspace and add it as an admin or as a member or as a contributor or as a viewer. So once the service principal is added to a workspace, it can then access it. Now, what we're going to do in my demos is that we're going to have the service principal create the workspace, which automatically makes it the admin, which means, it can do anything it wants. And it's also going to be, the one that creates data sets, making it the data set owner. Now, when we create an Azure AD application for a service principal, we're going to create something called a confidential application, not a public application. The idea of a confidential application is it can keep a secret. And, often when everything has to be put on a device or in the browser, you can't have secrets, so you have to have a public application. Now, the way that you make something a confidential application, is you pick that web dropdown. Next we're going to just leave the redirect URI text box completely empty. And redirect URIs are only used during user authentication, so they serve no purpose for service principal authentication. Now, once we've created the application, we need to get both the application ID and the hosting tenant ID, and those are going to have to be added to configuration. And then the one more thing we have to do is create an application secret. And the way to do that, for this test application is once you've created the app, to go to certificates and secrets, we're going to create a new secret. And once we've done that, we're going to take kind of the value of the secret. And, now if I go back here and we kind of look, the application, after you've created the application, you can just copy those details, into the app settings file, for things to work correctly. Now, next thing we'll talk about is you've created an Azure AD application. And as you get an access token, from that application using what's called client credentials flow, you have an access token for a service principal. But at first, you will fail with an access denied, whenever you try to call the Power BI REST API. So here's how we kind of enable things at the tenant level. We're going to start by creating an Azure AD security group. So what I typically, create mine as is I just name it Power BI apps. Then here's the part that requires that you're a Power BI tenant admin. We have to go into the admin portal, and we then kind of add that Azure AD security group, to a setting called Power BI allows service principals to use the API. Now, you can't configure service principals directly, so you have to create the group. And then after that, we're going to take the group and any Azure AD application for a service principal that I want to access, to be able to talk to the workspaces, we add, into this group. Now, once you've done this, let's be clear, because this confuses people. All this really does is give you permissions to call the Power BI REST API, but it doesn't give you permissions on any workspace. Quite often I work with customers who are trying to debug, I'm getting access denied. So the first thing is try to have a service principal call the get groups API, because you don't need permissions on anything to call get workspaces. And if you get back an empty result, you have no permissions, but you can call the API. Once the service principal is added as a workspace member, then it can start seeing and accessing other workspaces. And once again, as I'll show in my demo, if the service principal creates a workspace, it's automatically assigned as the admin member. Okay, now there's a lot of misconception I hear all the time. I see, people posting messages, but when you have an Azure AD application, created for a service principal, there's never any need to assign any type of Azure AD application. So when it comes to delegated permissions, we don't need those because they only apply to users. They're completely ignored with service principals. We don't want application permissions because they're not looked at all, ever, by the Power BI service. And it's kind of unfortunate that we have two there that you can assign because they don't help in any case. And what's more, if you do add application permissions, it will never help you, but it can hurt you. And we see a good number of support cases that people added application permissions. Hey, tenant read all. Hey, that looks good. But what happens is their application fails because the tenant admin, hasn't granted those application permissions. So when it comes to permissions, Scott, we just say use the Nancy rule. You know about the Nancy rule, right?
There is. I think so.
Just
Would
say
that
no.
be just say no? Yeah.
That's the Nancy rule. So when it comes to permissions for Azure AD applications for service principal. Okay, now I got two slides here where I've kind of coined them as deep thoughts. Do you remember on Saturday Night Live way long ago? I think it was back in the 30s.
Jack
They had the
Handy,
deep thought section. But this confuses people a lot. So I'm setting credentials for my, for the data source behind my data set, and I want to run a service principal. So there's two identities. There's the one that's setting the credentials, and that is the service principal. there's also, when I establish a connection, what identity do I use? And there's a lot of people that get confused thinking if you're using Service Principal to set credentials, that's the identity that's using to go to the data source. And that's not true. So I can use Service Principal to set credentials, but credentials, might be basic auth, with a username and password. And that's the identity. So one of the big takeaways, from this slide is that there are no built-in Power BI connectors, that support connecting to a data source as a Service Principal. If there were, it would give you a box to put in, the application ID and the application secret. So if you really want to connect to a data source as a Service Principal, in a proper fashion, the only way to do that today, is to build a custom connector. Okay, good thought. Now let's get on with some demos. Must be kind of boring on your end, just kind of listening to this guy huff about all this stuff. So what we're going to do is, we want to create, in some scenarios, workspaces and just automate creating the workspace and populating it with content. We don't want to do this stuff manually, but what's going to happen is I can write code to create a workspace, import a PBX file, but I'm not going to be able to connect the PBX file unless I also automate the process of, setting those data source credentials. Now, here are the steps that we're going to do, inside the demo. We're going to create a new workspace, assign a capacity, add workspace members. That's not so much what we're trying to cover here, but it's something I'm going to do, in the demo. But what we're going to do is, provision a data set from a PBX file, with a data set template, possibly update parameters, but then we're going to patch the credentials, so that we can run refresh operations. Okay, now let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go back here. And so in my demo, I tried to make it easy, by taking this and switching this between true or false, is how I switch between, running this, as a user, or running this, as a Service Principal. So let's run it as a Service Principal, and we'll just kind of do the very first thing right here. And we'll come back up here. I know you don't use Fiddler as much as I do, Scott, but now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and, we'll run this code right here, so you can kind of see that there's code that's, going up here, and, it's getting the access token for a Service Principal, and then it's creating a new workspace assigned to capacity. It's adding, me as the user. So as I run this demo here, the way that I can go test things is, let's go back to Power BI. I'm going to go kind of do a quick refresh. So it rebuilds what's in the workspaces menu. And I'm going to name this thing, a demo workspace. And note that I can come back here. This is just the way I set up my demo, so it's easy to test. But if I run this a second time, it simply deletes the workspace that was there, recreates it of the same name. And so this is just something where, it's going to be easier to kind of demo the code as I go through here, but this is, what it was a second ago. If I go, back to Power BI and back to refresh, now I can come back here and I can kind of see that, the GUID has changed because it's a whole new workspace. But what we did, is to, write code to create a workspace. And you can also see that this code looks to see if there's a workspace of the same name. And if it does, it deletes it. And that's just kind of part of my test code. Here's some code to assign a workspace to a capacity and to add a user to the workspace's membership. We're going to just pass over this because we want to move on to the better stuff. Now, when I want to import the PBX file, here's, where I use the post import with filing group. That's a long method name. You pass a stream, that basically has a byte array with a PBX file. And then you're going to see that the conflict mode that you pass, is very important. So if you don't pass this, it will keep creating more data sets that have the same name and they each have different GUIDs. So create or overwrite says, if there's not a imported data set and report of the same name, go ahead and create it. If there is one of the same name, replace that with what we're overwriting. So this is what we want in the vast majority of scenarios. Now, also, when you do the import, you got to make sure that the import completes, because you can't patch credentials, if the import operation is still ongoing. So now, once we've done the import, we might want to refresh. We might want to, look at the refresh schedule. Okay, that's great. Now, let's go back here, and I'm going to go back and notice that the first time you look at this, sometimes it doesn't give you the full menu, and that's because there's a little delay after you create it. So take a breath, do a refresh, and now we should see settings. So let's go down here and notice that Ted, the user, didn't create this, data set, but some user principal does. I want to get down here and kind of see the refresh schedule, and notice that if you're not the owner, you're locked out. Now, this, and now I just kind of want to show kind of the flexibility of this application. Let's go back here. And now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this, from call as user from false to true. So now we're going to run this, as a user. Note that I'm not getting login prompts because the application caches user tokens, so it's able to use those from previous runs. But now that we've done that, let's go back here, and once again, I'll kind of go back to Power BI. I'll refresh the browser, but now what you'll see is that we've created this with code. Let's do the quick refresh here. And so now when I drop in here, since I am, the owner, I can see that, but now I can kind of show you that we've got that set up. And it's not very complicated code, to set your refresh schedule, as you're creating something. Now, refresh on demand is great. Scheduled refresh is great. But, and here's the big point, Scott, it doesn't work until you patch the data source. So now, gosh, we're already half an hour in, and I'm finally getting to the topic that we talked about, and that is patching data source credentials. Now, we're going to see quite a few examples. And what I want to point out ahead of time is that there's going to be so much in common, as you move between different types of data sources and different types of credentials. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to take our data set and we're going to call something called datasets, get data sources in group. And what's important there is that returns this, JSON code that gives you two important IDs for your data source. There's the gateway ID and the data source ID. And so then what we do is we create this update data source request object. And in our case, you kind of see in there that we're using anonymous credentials. Now, you can set the privacy level of the connection to none, organization, private, or public. That's going to be the same for all the examples we see. And then we're going to set the encryption type to not encrypted. And kind of the short story is we're not going to use encryption until we start using credentials with the on-premises data gateway. Okay, we'll see that in the very last section. And then finally, we call gateways.update data source. Now, what's confusing to people is that they would say, hey, my data source doesn't go through an on-premises gateway. This can't be right. I can't have a gateway ID, or why am I using gateways.update data source? Okay, I think you'll like this one, Scott. You recognize the picture?
Yeah, that's from my childhood.
Kung Fu, grasshopper, learning from the master.
That's
Can
right.
you grab the pebbles from my hand? So I wanted this slide to be an important learning moment. And that is that all data sources have a gateway ID, even when they're not using the on-premises gateway. And that's just an amazing source of confusion, and online questions and support tickets. So Power BI kind of has behind the scenes what we call a virtual gateway, for data sources that, connect directly to a cloud data source. And so whenever you're patching credentials in the virtual gateway, you're always using gateways.updata source. And, if you get this information, tell other people, just because I guess it's, not obvious or non-intuitive. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and kind of, work through using basic credentials. So for the demo right here, what I'm going to do is, let's go back here to our demo, and I'm going to take the return statement away. And now we'll run this, up through all the SQL data source options right here. Okay, so what we're going to do, it's going to take a second to run, is, we're going to run this code, which is going to create the new workspace, create the PBX file with the anonymous data source like we just saw, but now we're going to create a data, a data set with a SQL data source that points to one SQL database. And we'll use the exact same PBX dataset template, and we'll use parameters, so we can point to a different database. Okay, and then we'll also kind of talk about, patching credentials for a SQL data source behind a paginated report. And then finally, there's the PBX file. So once we have, created this right here, let's go back and kind of see, what things are going to look like. And so I'll come back here. I'll go ahead and I will refresh. And so now, look at all of the things that we've created here. And so we'll start by looking at, here's this data set for wingtip sales, and there's a report on top of it. And, this company has data, that's all over the US. Okay, and then there's a second one, which is the Contoso sales. And what we'll see is that we have the exact same data set and report. We just kind of parameterized away where the database lives, so we can kind of use this data set, to on demand kind of create, data sets, for different customers. So the key to this is when you create a data set, to design it with data set parameters. So in our case, we have a pair of parameters, which is database server and database name. Now, in your M code, it's important that you never use hard-coded paths, but instead, you'll use these parameters. And the flexibility that gives you is that we can import a PBX file, and then after the PBX file has been imported, well, I'm going to use the same PBX file to create two different data sets. But the first time I create it, we're going to use this update mashup parameters request. Man, that's an object name only a mother could love. But you can see that, you have the details in there, and we're able to set those and then call update parameters. Now, the one gotcha here is that, you can set parameters, through the UI. You can set them with code. But if a parameter affects the location of the data source, it basically, invalidates any credentials you have. So if you basically have a data set and it's pointed to SQL database 1 and you set credentials, and then through parameters you point to SQL database 2, credentials don't work anymore because credentials are, scoped to, the path to the data source. Now, when we want to patch SQL credentials, we're going to call, just like before, get data sources in group to get the gateway ID and the data source ID. I will bring in the arrow here. I'm bringing in the arrow when something is different than the last time. So instead of creating this update data source request object with anonymous credentials, we use basic credentials. But other than that, everything is the same. So once again, you can kind of see that, it's a very repeatable, pattern that you write in code to set credentials. Okay, now, how about importing paginated reports? Now, you can use the imports API to import a PBX file. Everyone, who uses the imports API knows that. But I guess what's not as widely known is that you can also import RDL files with a paginated report and data flow definitions. So to import a paginated report, we're going to call same thing, post import with file in group, but we have to take the import name and add .rdl to it. When it creates the report, it takes the .rdl off, but you kind of ending the import name with .rdl is the clue to basically say process this as an RDL file. And the second thing is that the import conflict handler has to be set to abort. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but don't ask any questions. It would be better if the import conflict handler mode, would set this to paginated reports, because you use it for paginated reports and you don't use it for anything else. Now, let's say that we've just imported a paginated report, but it doesn't bind to a data set. It binds directly to SQL. So we need to basically patch the data set. Once again, here are the steps, and I'll bring in the arrow when something is different. So here, this is different. Before, you called datasets.get data resources and group and pass the dataset ID. Here, you're calling reports.get data sources and group. And once again, this only works for paginated reports, that have their own data sources behind them. And then what you can see is, everything else, including the call to gateway.update data sources, is the same as what we've seen before. Now, a little bit more here. Let's say I want to import a data flow. Now, as Scott and I, hear a lot from our customers, reports and data sets, were created at the beginning, and data flows were kind of added a little bit afterwards, and they kind of, play the role of the red-haired stepchild. But there is support, for importing a data flow. So the idea is you put the data flow definition in a JSON file. Now, you also set the name of the import to model.json. And once again, that's the flag to the imports API saying process this, as a data flow definition. Now, if you put the import model.json, what is the name that shows up of the data flow, in the Power BI service? And it turns out it's part of the, JSON data flow definition has the name. Another thing is for the conflict handler, you've seen that, you have to use generate unique name. If you want to think about it, that we should have just used conflict handler mode data flow. We should have done that, because this is also a case where you only use it for data flows and you have to use it for data flows. Okay. The last import, I called this out before, but data flow import is only supported for users. It's not supported for service principals, unfortunately. Now, you import a data flow, just like a data set or a paginated report connected to SQL. It's got data behind it. You want to refresh it, but you can't refresh it till you patch credentials. So once again, there's an arrow where things are different from what you've seen before. And the one thing that's different is you can go up to a data flow and say, get data flow data sources. It passes you back the data sources. Notice that another red-haired stepchild syndrome side effect is that with report and dataset objects, they have a .id. For data flows, they have a .object ID. So just don't let that catch you off guard. It should have been called, target data flow.id, but its name is not as consistent as it could be. Other than that, nothing else changes. So the idea is you get back a data source, whether it's for a data set or a paginated report or a data flow, and you basically call gateways.update data source. So once again, once you kind of see that big picture, it gets to be easier to figure out how things work. Now, when we provision content with the data flow, this is kind of a tricky provisioning step. So step one is what we've seen. You want to basically create the data flow and patch credentials so you can refresh the data in the data flow. Well, the next step is we need to layer a Power BI data set on top of it. So what this demo does is it imports a PBX file, but when you create a PBX file in Power BI Desktop, you can't really connect it to this data flow because it hasn't been created yet. So what the demo does is it uses we've created a workflow and we've created a data flow. So we can get the IDs of both those, and then we can pass them as parameters, to the Power BI data set so it can connect to that data flow. Now, the last thing here, it's kind of esoteric, but, what if you then, you've got the data set parameters, you've connected to this workflow, but then you need to patch credentials. So you're patching credentials so the data set can connect to the data flow before you can do the refresh. And so here, it's code that no one would ever think of. I was lucky enough to have a PM send me this code and see, says here's how to do it. But what you're able to do is use this special trick where you say, use kind of the identity, of the caller. And that could be, and once again, that has to be a user, not a service principal. Okay, so what do you think, Scott? Is this pretty exciting stuff?
This is great, man. There's so much in here, and it's amazing that you've been able to like show demos of all the various ways. I don't know that. Yeah, this is great. You can just see how much flexibility there is, how much power, and I know that I'm going to go back and rewatch parts of this when I get into those particular situations. This is great. I'm enjoying this.
Okay, so here we're going to do something. Before I go through the slides, I'm going to get rid of the code triggered in demos 1 through 4 because we've already seen that, and we'll just kind of look at the code for demo 5 here. So what we're doing here is we've got a Power BI desktop project that connects to an Excel file that is inside of Azure Data Lake storage. And we're also going to have some parameters so I can use one data set as a template and create a data set and point it to file 1 and create another data set and point it to file 2. Now, if we kind of go back here and let's now kind of go back to workspaces and kind of see what we've created here. Now, unfortunately, Scott, I didn't put a lot of effort into making these reports look good. I had 2 different files. I should have changed the name, but this kind of shows that, we can have one data set, point to one file, and then we go to this other one. I didn't even change the names, but the numbers are much bigger. But the idea here, is that we can, set parameters, to point to something inside here. Let me get back to this slide. Now, as I mentioned, I want to create, a PBX data set, in Power BI Desktop that's not hard coded to, one particular ALDS container or one particular file name. So the demo is kind of based on, being able to set these parameters. That's why those 2 different reports and their underlying data sets, are showing different data. Here, there's different connectors that you can use. I think the most current and recommended one, is the Azure storage that you'll see, if you look at the M code, and it's able to kind of bring that data down. But there you'll see that there's no hard-coded aspects in the M code. It's just looking at the ALDS container and the Excel file name. Now, remember that once you have set these values that affect, the location, then I'm going to have to pass the credentials. Now here, everything is the same except for, the credential type that we're creating. Now, if you use basic credentials, you have a username and a password. The username is kind of the name of the identity, and the password is the credential that kind of lets you in. What's kind of strange about keys is they're both the identity and the password in one. So when you use, a key, you're able just to create a key credential object and automatically, set the credentials. Okay. Now here, to connect to ADLS, I'm using key credentials. But what I often see, people are connecting to other data sources like Databricks and Snowflake, and they're not sure what credential type to use. And in general, especially if you're running a service principal, if you can use key credentials, that is what we're going to recommend. And you'll kind of see why that's the case as we go through this next section. Now, before we do that, we have another deep thoughts section. And the reason I'm having deep thoughts here is to kind of go through this idea that each data set is owned by a single security principal. So the idea is that updating parameters and patching data source credentials is only allowed by the dataset owner. The dataset owner can be a single user, a single service principal, or a single service principal profile. Now, you can't have an Azure AD group, be the owner, because then that would be multiple security principals. But that kind of trips people up, because if you've set the credentials, I can't go in and change the parameters afterwards, or I can't set the refresh schedule. So the idea is that there can only be one owner. In our case, I'm creating a data set, as either a user or a service principal, and the creator is automatically the owner. However, if we need to transfer ownership, we need a takeover action. Now, what I want to do is kind of explain, because people are like, this is just such a pain. Why can't they just make it so 4 of us, can all co-manage the data set? So there is a good reason, but it takes some thinking to kind of get to it. The single owner constraint is enforced mainly for security reasons. So Power BI within the virtual gateway doesn't support this idea of having a credential that's shared across users or a connection that's shared across users. We can share the data set, but we can't, share the connection. Only the owner can modify certain data set properties. Now, to illustrate this, let's go back to my demo right here. And, back here in my demo, let's go back up here. And to make this demo work, first thing I have to explicitly delete this. But what I want to do is I want to recreate these, but create them, as a service principal. And I've spelled false correctly. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this a second time. Now, in this case right here, the service principal, is the data set owner. Okay, let's wait till this finishes here. And now that it's finished, we'll go back and we'll take a look at this right here. Okay, you ready for this light to go off, Scott? Let's go back here into settings. And you can see, hey, you're not the data set owner. This guy is. You can take it over. And I'm going to go down here and say, gosh, I'd really like to kind of change these parameters. So let's say I do a takeover event. Okay, now I'm the owner. I can come down here and, let's go ahead and change this to, leadership, complaints against others. But the idea is, if you just give me this blank check where I can point to anything, and whoever signed the credentials, I can do anything that they can do. I mean, that's a pretty huge security hole. So the idea is, if you do a takeover, that's great, but you've got to be the one that applies the credentials. You can't use the other person's credentials. If you need more flexibility by kind of having, credentials set one time, that's what the on-premises gateway is for. It kind of brings in overhead that maybe you don't want, but we really don't have the equivalent of that, in the virtual gateway. So once again, I just kind of wanted to kind of go through and kind of explain, why does a data set require a single owner? And, we'll see, allowing others to update a data set and reuse credentials, it would create an attack surface. So I'm not saying we'll never fix this, but it's not a simple fix. It's basically, adding this idea, of sharing credentials, or sharing connections across users and security principals, which, has no support and would be a heavy lifting task. So the rule, whoever last updates the data set has to be the one to set credentials. And this also kind of gives you the, if you set credentials with a service principal, you can't go and tweak any parts, of the data set definition through the UI, because you can't log in as a service principal. Okay, 2 more sections here. So the next thing we're going to look at, is patching, different data sources, SharePoint and Kusto, with OAuth2 credentials. Now, for this one, let's go back here and we'll set this one back to true. We'll also come down here, and now we're in the home stretch where this is the last live demo that I'm going to show. Okay, but let's also go through here and remove some of this stuff so we can kind of see some of the things behind the scenes. And so here, what we're going to do is we're going to set credentials, with a access token. And we'll see that, in a second as I look, and the slides are probably going to be a good place to go in a second. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and refresh. Let's go back to demo workspaces right here. And once I get to this demo workspace, you can see that we've kind of created, a couple different data sources right here. So if you want to set OAuth credentials for something in SharePoint, the first step is you cannot use the web connector, which is unfortunate because, I was kind of taught, if you're going to a SharePoint file, prefer the web connector over the SharePoint connectors because they can be more performant. But unfortunately, the web connector, while it supports OAuth2 credentials, doesn't support it, setting them programmatically. So if they need to be set programmatically, you have to kind of move from the web connector, to the SharePoint connector. You can kind of get the same thing done. Maybe it's a new way of doing things, but if this is important, there is a way to get it done. Second, setting OAuth2 credentials requires that you create an access token for the thing you want to connect to. And so it's going to take kind of more understanding of Azure AD and how, delegated permissions get added to access tokens. Now, here's a bit of bad news. When we set OAuth2 credentials, you can set the access token, but you can also add a refresh token. And so what that means is when you set OAuth2 credentials, they're going to be short-lived, typically 60 minutes, the lifetime of that access token. Now, the Power BI REST API does not support patching refresh tokens, so using the OAuth token, that's a known issue. It's short-lived. Now, let's look at how we can do this. So let's say that I want to connect to SharePoint. So first thing is I have to decide what user and make sure that user has permissions on the target. And then also we're going to have to create an access token, that has, the right permissions inside of it. If I can come back here, and we can, let's see if I do this and we just look at these right here. At some point, let's see. Okay. You can kind of see right here, that, here is a permission request. And, once I put this permission request in, you get back the access token, and that's what you're going to set into those credentials. And when you call this, there is a refresh token, but you can't really use it in any way, which is unfortunate. So here what you can see is, we create the, permission scope for the delegated permission. I then have to call to Azure AD to get this access token. And then we're going to use the OAuth2 credential. Other than that, everything's the same, that we've seen before. and then we call, gateway.update data sources as usual. Now, just to mix things up, for this last one, what I wanted to do is show using OAuth2 credentials. Now, remember I said you can't use service principal? Here's a little fudge where, inside of my Custo data source, I went and configured it so my service principal has access. So the idea is when you use OAuth2 credentials, it just has you stick in an access token. It doesn't whether care, whether you have a user token, or a service principal token. So what I've done kind of here in this demo, is to kind of put together a data set template. So once we create the data set, I can point it to a different Custo server, or a different database. I just started writing Custo queries. Scott, here's my first Custo query. How is that? It's pretty good, isn't it?
Very nice. Yeah.
Okay. I feel very accomplished.
Are you a Custo detective?
I guess I must be.
Okay.
Now, here, you're going to have to get a access token. And if you want to get, an access token for a user, it's something that took me a little bit of hunting to figure out, what is the resource. And it, doesn't include the name of your, Custo server. It includes Custo, your region, and Custo again. But if you're using delegated permissions, you just have that resource ID with user impersonation. And if you're creating, a access token for a service principal, you don't want permissions, but you do have to kind of give it the resource ID that you want to access. But once you have those, things work, just fine. But let's kind of end with some observations, about working with OAuth2 credentials. Once set, they're always short-lived. So they're only going to live, for 60 minutes, which is certainly an issue for a lot of scenarios. As a user, you can do things in the Power BI service that cannot be replicated with code. So if you set OAuth credentials through the UI, it automatically gets the refresh token and you have a long-lived thing. So once again, it's just a gap in the API that you have to, work around. So I'd say the key takeaways here is that OAuth credentials work fine if you have a process that sets the credentials and then starts a refresh operation. That works fine. What doesn't work is when you use OAuth credentials and you've got scheduled refresh, to run several times a day. So what we recommend, to customers, is to create some type of a scheduled piece of code. An Azure function would do this and run it every 45 minutes and simply reset the token. So certainly that is something that, is a possibility. But at a higher level, I would prefer key credentials over OAuth2 credentials on any backend that's provided it, especially if you're using, service principals. Key credentials, just give you a much better way to connect without this issue of, the token expiring. Okay, I know we're 1 minute over, but I've got just a couple more slides here I want to go through. We're kind of done with the demos, Scott.
That's good.
But I just kind of wanted to at a high level, talk about programming with, on-premise gateway data sources. So there is code, in a separate class, On-Prem Gateway Manager. So let's just kind of, look at a couple code examples before we break today. Now, one thing is you can run this as a user or a service principal, but if you're running, the calls to program against an on-premises gateway, for a user, you're going to need the gateway read all or gateway read write all delegated permission. In addition to that, the user or service principal, will need to be, either a gateway cluster, admin or some other type of user, to be able to get access to it. Now, just starting out simple, there is a gateways API. So if you call get gateways, it's going to return all the gateways, which you have permissions to see. Now, once you get to a gateway, I call them gateways. Officially they're called a gateway cluster, because it could be several of them there. But the idea is when you call get gateways, it returns, all the different gateways that you have access to. In general, if you have one gateway in question, you can just record the gateway ID GUID and use that to connect to the gateway. Now, steps to create a new gateway data source is that, unlike the data source behind a data set that already has a path, when you're creating these, you're kind of blind. So one of the things that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to, create a little piece of JSON, that is the connection details. As I've been going through the examples, one thing my code does, is kind of spit these things out here, at the end. And the idea is, what are the connection details? Well, if you go look at an existing one, well, it's server and database. Great. Okay, well, what about for an ADLL database? It's server and path. So the idea here is that, you're going to create, and this is just a little C# trick where you create a new anonymous object, and then you can put whatever you want down here. And the idea is you can then just serialize it, and it spits out the string that you need. Now, next thing I want to point out is, right here, earlier, we kind of saw that there was, support for encrypting, but we don't really need to encrypt when we're in the virtual gateway because those are automatically encrypted for us. It's when we're programming, against a on-prem gateway. And what you'll see is that the gateway has a public key. And what you need to do is create this thing called the asymmetric key encryptor. And, after that, you're going to create credential details. And if you look at the credential details, you create it the exact same way as we've been doing all along, with the one exception of, you basically, have the support for, encryption down below. But other than that, everything you're doing is the same. And then there is a publish data source to gateway request. And so here, while the credentials we looked at earlier just had credential details, this also has connection details. Plus, you have to specify the data source type. Is it SQL? Is it ADLS? And once again, you can kind of just look to, once you've created things and you kind of go back and look at them, you can figure out, what that type is. And then the data source gets a name. And then finally, you're going to call gateways, create data source to create them. Now, one thing that's very popular with an on-prem gateway is to get data from a database you can't get to without a gateway. So for instance, we have a on-prem gateway on our machine in our local area network. We have a SQL database that we want to connect to. So we can basically use Windows credentials. And that allows you to kind of use authentication protocols, that work inside of local area networks. There's also another one called user password credentials that you can use, in local area networks. But other than that, it's the exact same as what you've seen. Just to show, one more example, here we're creating a gateway data source, but we're using key credentials. And, you can imagine that if you're, in the IT department and you have this key to access very sensitive data, do you want to give it to your data set builders, or do you want to, create a connection here and then kind of give them permissions to bind? Now, the last thing I want to cover is once you've created your data source, inside the on-prem gateway, you need to connect it, or, what we call bind it, to a data source. Now, in order to do the binding, the caller, has to be added, as a gateway member, before it can create gateway data sources. Now, if you're just binding, you don't have to, be a member of the gateway. You just has to be added as a member of the data source. But the caller, has to be a data source member. And, here's the code if you need to add a user, or a service principal as a data source member. Because if you're the IT staff, you might want to have a service principal create this, but then you could run code, to kind of add users, as members, to different data sources so they could do the binding, but then you never have to share credentials with that crowd. The last thing here, the very last demo we're going to do, or the very last piece of code, is the steps, to bind to a gateway data source. Let's not gloss over the first bullets. In order to do this, there is a data source, in the gateway, and there is a data set that you want to bind to that data source. So you have to be a member of the gateway data source, and you have to be the owner of the data set. Once you've done that, you're going to create a bind to gateway request. Now, when you create this, you always have to pass the gateway ID. And the idea is when it looks at the gateway and it looks at your data source and sees, is there going to be a match, between what you're trying to get and what's there, it'll automatically bind you. So you don't have to pass data source IDs. Once again, it will find the match automatically. But if there's ambiguity, you had multiple data sources that kind of had the same path, you're able to pass the data source ID, when you create the bind to gateway request. If you're not the owner, you can just, execute take over and group, and now you are the owner. But then finally you call datasets bind to gateway and group. And now we've kind of automated the whole process, of creating a new data source in a gateway, uploading a Power BI, PBX project with a data source, and then binding, one to the other. Okay, so I went a little bit over here, Scott, but now we finally got to the end. Okay, would you be able to give this lecture to your wife tomorrow?
I think so. In fact, that would be, if anybody is interested, I'm more than happy to do this. I'll probably do it as an interpretive dance or maybe a little song or something. But yeah, this is great, man. I'm impressed with the depth and the breadth of what you've been able to share with us. This is really it's so much information, and if you don't have the ability, or you don't have the experience that you, Ted, have, it'd be easy to get lost in the wilderness below on this. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and the breadth of this. This is fantastic information.
Yeah, I guess it's just me and some other guys I work with, Sergey Gundarov and Afar Ashkenazi. We just get tons of feedback and questions, and important customers that can't figure stuff out. So over the last 3 years, we've just seen so many cases, and a lot of this was just kind of built from trying to put all the information we've learned, to answer the questions or stop people from getting these gotchas. So I know it's really packed. I think for a lot of people, we showed 43 things and you need 2 of them for your next project.
Right.
But maybe down the road, you'll need things 17. So just being able to go there and look at that slide to see how to, import the data set or import the data flow, is going to be good.
Yeah,
but
fantastic
other than
work.
that, we want to kind of thank everyone for coming. A very non-interactive audience today. But questions, always be asking them to yourself and have those deep thoughts. So with that, Scott, I think we need to bid adieu to everyone. Thank you for attending.
Right. Well, sounds good, man. Well, thank you very much once again, and look forward to the next Dev Camp. Any previews on what the topic is for the next one, or?
Yes, next month, for right at the end of May, we're going to have a part 2 of the building multi-language reports. And we're going to get into some more involved scenarios. We're going to look at implementing data translations. So we definitely have more to show there. Pretty excited about that.
Well, I'm excited to hear it. Very good. I look forward to it. And until then, thanks very much to you and for all the campers.